You're watching Live1.tv from New York with our coverage on the 2024 presidential election. We got to speak with candidate for president Emanuel Pastreich, who is the president of the Asia Society in Washington, D.C. and Seoul and Tokyo, and a senior fellow with the Global Peace Foundation.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, Ian, especially at this incredibly important historical moment for the United States when things are falling apart, both globally and domestically, not by coincidence at the same time. And I'm honored to have a chance to speak to everybody today. So in terms of my background, I was originally a professor at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and I taught Japanese culture. I'm probably distinct among candidates in that I speak Japanese, Korean, and Chinese with a high level of fluency, and I've been trained in Asian studies. Along the way at University of Illinois, I became interested in international relations. I realized how out of control our whole military system was and started to write about what real security would be as opposed to things that make money for rich people. And then in 2020, when I saw the launch with my own eyes, I was in Washington, D.C. of the COVID-19 operation, and I saw what Trump was doing and what Biden was doing. I said, this is not a choice. And so I made a declaration of candidacy for president as independent. I lasted in the United States for 2 weeks, and I had to go to Korea. But I continued my campaign in Korea throughout the whole COVID regime. And then it came back to the U.S. I'm in Tokyo right now, but I'll be in the U.S. tomorrow. And I guess the most important recent developments last year, I was in the Green Party as one of two candidates for president. That was myself and Cornel West. We're the only two who had websites and who were registered and had basically done our homework. And I was blocked. So the Green Party refused to mention me in any of their formal materials. Cornel West obviously never talked to me. And the media, and not even independent media, with a couple of rare exceptions, mentioned that I existed. And so after 1 month in the Green Party, unable to raise any funds and get any coverage, I decided that this was not worth the trouble. However, I have a lot of friends in the Green Party, and specifically in what's called Green Liberty Caucus, Green Liberty PAC, which is a group in the Green Liberty which is trying to build bridges between what you might call progressive and libertarian conservative groups. And we have been quite successful because we're willing to discuss state crimes, something which, as you know, many of the so-called progressives who don't have many bones in their body are not willing to take on state crimes. And so they use a sort of progressive, inclusive language as a way to sort of put a velvet glove on a steel fist. And that was, for Green Liberty, just unacceptable. If we don't take on state crimes, none of this identity politics is going to mean much.
You're watching Live1.tv from New York and our interview with presidential candidate Emanuel Pastreich from Japan. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to our channel. We have interviewed with independent candidate for president Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai, as well as presidential candidate Mike Termat running on the Libertarian platform. And now we return to our interview with presidential candidate Emanuel Pastreich as he discusses state crimes. I feel this is, we're zeroing in.
Well, I really appreciate it. And I think it's important for the people to know that it's not as if there aren't any candidates out there, anyone who's capable of doing a serious job. It's that the whole system is so completely rigged that it's impossible. And maybe I could just say a word about how it works. So there are two sort of tiers to it. One is just if you're saying something which the powers that be don't want to have heard. I tend to stress the three truths: 9/11 truth, COVID-19 truth, and Federal Reserve truth, which is how we counterfeit trillions of dollars and then then launder the money through the Pentagon or other sources, now expanded to include all parts of the federal government. That if you address any of these three truths, even indirectly, that you're not going to be able to raise any money. So you can't play within the standard field. You can't get on TV. You can't be invited to events, and even the so-called truth tellers, which for the most part are limited hangout, are not going to engage you. But there's another level to it, and those are the specific programs, right? So specific, I mean, most primarily it's Homeland Security. Homeland Security has a series of anti-disinformation budgets. These are used by largely these days by private contractors. So it's not, people say it's government, but it's really not government. So it'd be like Booz Allen Hamilton or Cassie, for example. There's now a whole range of these firms, including many Israeli firms, by the way. And so they get the Homeland Security budgets, and their job is not necessarily to kill you or to threaten you, but just to make sure that you're not going to go anywhere. So they'll throw people to be your supporters who will then stab you in the back, or they'll block you out of social media or other things, and people think, or for that matter, you'd be on YouTube and 10,000 people see your video, but the YouTube will just say 3, right? Things like that, low level, low intensity, what we call, what's both lawfare, warfare, harassment. And by the way, that really is now what Israel is the king of the hill these days. So Israel has developed extremely sophisticated forms of interference. Gaza, as and this is one of the things I was really disappointed with people like Cornel West, sort of saying Gaza is about how mean Israelis are to Palestinians. So this is a truth. I don't deny that. But Gaza is ultimately a experiment. It's a test bed for using various forms of surveillance, tracking, intelligence, convergence, and use of drones, robots, and a variety of other technologies, which I think haven't actually been disclosed to the public, to systematically, basically, at the beginning of the Gaza event, operation, I think they selected like 20,000 people in Gaza who they were going to kill, and they put it all in the supercomputers, and they killed them all over the period of 3 months. So the point about this is this could be your neighborhood, right, in a couple of years, once they perfected the technology. When I say they, I'm not just talking about Israelis, right? I'm talking about anybody who would be interested in buying this technology from, say, Black Cube, for example, which is one of the big vendors in Israel. They can put it in your neighborhood. So it could be, Arkansas, it can be Texas, your neighborhood. And this is increasingly true in the United States. The very unfortunate sort of blending together of the United States and Israel, and to some degree, I would say also the UK, into this information, military, industrial, financial cluster, blob.
I'm right with you, Emanuel. I find it disgusting, and later on I could show you the materials we have, how Live One was being harassed by Global Stratfor. And
they're also a player, yeah.
And General Dynamics, and together with another person on Twitter X named Politics out of California, we actually exposed a guy named Prerak Joshi, and I reported him to the police. I have a police report for cyber stalking. Submitted it to Congressman Troy Nehls down in Texas, where this group working with General Dynamics operates. So I'm right with you.
Well, General Dynamics is one of the big players. I mean, as I wrote, I gave a recent talk about Larry Ellison and Oracle. Oracle is one of the biggest, I think, criminal syndicates out there globally. And the way Oracle works, it's true for General Dynamics or a lot of other players, Microsoft, Amazon, and others, is it basically takes over the government. So people think a coup d'etat would be, guys in guns like suddenly seize power and that sort of the so-called January 6th incident, which we can talk about what that it's a that's a sort of 60-40 mix of truth and fiction, but that's not what's going on now. The coup d'etat takes on by outsourcing the functions of government, first by forcing digitalization and online functions, and then outsourcing that to companies like Amazon and Oracle, who then essentially run all communications, control all information, and then at the same time lobby for what policy should be. So essentially, they've taken over the government. And this, I really want to stress for the American people, like, why support someone like me who's not on the ballot in any state at this point? And I think it's quite simple. If Cornel West is telling, or for that matter, if Biden or I'm not sure where Biden is, but his people are telling you something like, vote for me, otherwise we're going to be living in a totalitarian state, be the end of democracy, then they're obviously lying to you. Democracy is been in the coffin for quite a long time. We're not trying to defend democracy. We're trying to reestablish the rule of law and accountability in the United States. So we should just, forget about self-deception and just say to ourselves, how do we go from the state of totalitarian rule with a couple like limited hangout oases, sort of like Disneyland, where you can go and have some fun, and actually get back to an accountable government that actually it has the interests of the people as its purpose, and that is transparent to the degree possible. And that's the cycle that we're hoping to start. So supporting me, even if I'm not on the ballot, means a lot, because it means you're actually saying that we're demanding an accountable government.
So sometimes people don't recognize the power of a write-in ballot. You would be a write-in candidate.
Absolutely.
Okay, I got it. Right with you there. I actually submitted a lawsuit to the Attorney General in New York. At the time, it was, I believe, Eric Schneiderman. And I did it on the behalf of the Lawyers for Ron Paul. And we were insisting that they, because New York does have a write-in ballot, but they don't count them. And when you read the Supreme Court ruling from the Civil Rights Act, the extension of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, it says that there's some beautiful language. Everybody has a right to vote their conscience without threat, intimidation, or coercion. But a very important part of that law is, and that their vote be counted. And so, they were putting write-in ballots in states, and then they weren't counting them. And so that's what the lawsuit was about.
Well, we really have to look at sort of both sides of the equation. On the one hand, obviously, we want to have votes count, and have a transparent system for electing people following the Constitution. At the same time, we have to go back to the Declaration of Independence, which says that when in historical course, the government becomes tyrannical, that we have both a right and an obligation to establish new means for the common security. I don't remember the exact wording, and that this is very real. So we have to simultaneously move towards close relations with each other, yourself and myself, self-support, self-help groups to establish from the ground up independent citizens groups, which can then claim to be following the Constitution, Declaration of Independence. And over time, these groups that we are forming would be able to then go to the federal government. Actually, I think we can do it already now. And some people are already doing this to some degree, and say, if you say you're Homeland Security, it's a little shout out for our friends at Homeland Security who are there with listening, and who I think both of us assume are not necessarily our opponents. We support in that we're following Constitution. It's for the long-term interests of the people of the United States. So the resistance has to be such that when we build up economically and also spiritually and ideologically independent thinking, that we will go to the people who are calling themselves Homeland Security or calling themselves Department of Defense or calling themselves Department of Treasury, and we will say to them, we follow the Constitution, we follow the Declaration of Independence. This defines what is and is not the United States, what is and is not the government, right? You guys call yourselves Homeland Security, but everything you're doing goes against the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, and you're not government. It's all been outsourced to Amazon and Facebook and Microsoft and Cisco. I mean, the whole variety of these that you mentioned, General Dynamics. So in that case, your guys are not the government, right? And so the first step is to say it. Obviously, most of these overpaid bureaucrats and corporate people are going to laugh their heads off of that. But if you do it strategically and effectively and with sufficient bravery and determination, then there may be a shift, right? A point at which the question of where the legitimacy is, who is a constitutional government in the United States, starts to come into play. And then we get real change, real fundamental change. Sadly, we have, in the case of the Donald Trump campaign, a partial effort to do that. And there are people who support Donald Trump who are people like myself. But sadly, Donald Trump was created by a bunch of billionaires, Mercer and Adelson and others, Thiel, and they want to use that idea that he's going to take on the deep state, reestablish democracy, get rid of all these foreign powers, dangerous trade and financial agreements. But it's just a show. Ultimately, decisions is going to be a fight. That the real fight for them at that level is a fight between different groups of billionaires who have different interests. IT billionaires, natural resources, gas, oil, mining billionaires, transport, logistics billionaires, real estate billionaires, and finance billionaires, of course, the people who actually just buy or hedge funds and derivatives and all that garbage. So it is a real struggle. We should not underestimate, and they're willing to kill each other, but it's a struggle between different kinds of billionaires with different kinds of financial interests. It's not a struggle between we the people and the oligarchs.
Yeah, on that subject, Patrick Byrne, the founder of Overstock.com, which recently bought Bed Bath & Beyond, Patrick Byrne said about 6 months ago when he was in Chamonix, France, I have a little video of him, and he said he thinks that they're going to possibly kill Donald Trump, and he's a supporter of Trump. And he said that Biden would be willing to lose 3 American cities just to have the election canceled.
Well, so I certainly, some scenario like that is entirely possible. I don't know that Donald Trump. My guess is Donald Trump is a smart guy, and he's not really a politician. So my guess is there's some way for him to get out of this, or at least he thinks there is. But the possibility that people would be killed is certainly there, and we have, of course, these two sort of bookends of predictive programming films. Predictive programming are films that show you what's going to happen in a slightly indirect way, and they encourage the viewer of the film to adopt the stance of the people in the film. So the film shows people who are passive. They can't do anything about this situation. They're sort of like on the edges. The film doesn't show anybody organizing, anyone doing anything. And so by making these sorts of films predicting what's going to happen, this was done for 9/11 as well, it encourages people to be passive and open to suggestion and not to organize resistance. And so the two films were, now I forget the title, the Obama family had put together. It's like say goodbye to the world. Do you remember the name of the title of the book, the movie? I can pull it up. it's so anyway. It's about a cyber attack. Um,
I found it. Leave the world behind,
Leave the World
Emmanuel.
Behind. So it's called Leave Behind World Behind, in which the whole country is shut down by a cyber attack and chaos ensues, and it includes in it a scene which you may remember in which a tanker is cyber hacked and crashes into the beach. It's actually a prediction of what happened with the Francis Scott Key Bridge incident. So there's a sort of intentional overlap, and the people in the movie are intentionally presented as being passive. I mean, maybe have a little spiritual, understanding, but there's no one organizing anything, anyone doing anything. It's just like they're all victims. It's all beyond their control. The second movie, which was just out in commemoration of the beginning of the Civil War, is called, well, you know it, Civil War. And it's also similar predictive programming about a civil war which breaks out in the United States, and how people are sort of the chaotic situation in which people are caught up in it, but somehow citizens are disempowered and it's beyond their control. So I think these two movies did not just randomly get released. They were an attempt to prep us for what's going to happen over the next 2 years.
Yeah, wow. This is going to make it difficult for me to pursue my hobbies. I've been trying to become a better piano player and read more books. What are we going to do trying to fight real tyranny? It sounds like worse than stories I heard about Joseph Stalin.
Right. Well, so that's where we are. And I think, I'm reminded when you say that there was a Byzantine emperor. I can't remember the name, but there's a famous story about him in which his advisor said to him something like, "The world is all against you, emperor," and the emperor replied, "No, I'm against the world." So to some degree, it's a matter of attitude. If you assume the position that being one or two or 10 or 100 is totally legitimate and we can take a stand, that can be transformative. And I would give the examples. The most obvious example of this is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, in which case a relatively small number of people took on the entire, fascist system, and they fought it out for 5 days. Basically, almost all of them were killed, but the fact that they were able to take the stand transformed the entire environment in Europe in 1943, and you started to get resistance popping up all over Central and East Europe against the fascists. And Europe was basically fascist. It wasn't just the Germans. And so, although the incident itself was not successful militarily, it changed the environment. So we really need, I guess that's the point of my campaign, to have at least a couple people standing up, and that will be modeled and replicated elsewhere. And the other case would be John Brown and on the issue of slavery. I talk a lot about slavery, not just a matter of like what happened to African Americans in the past and its consequences today, although that is very real, but because slavery is the agenda now, that we're being turned into slaves slowly, using IT and entertainment to dumb us down and restricting what jobs are and how they're obtained, restricting access to capital for ordinary people. And so the agenda is to turn us into slaves. This is obvious consequence. When you get a certain degree of concentration of wealth, any society that you pass a certain threshold in terms of concentration of wealth and assets is going to move towards a slave society. This has been true for the last 10,000 years. So in the case of the resistance to slavery, John Brown and his group went to Harper's Ferry. He could only get a small number of people to follow him, a couple hundred, I think. And they said, we take the federal, compound. I don't remember the military base there in Harper's Ferry, and we declare that slavery is not a peculiar institution, but it's an act of war against the citizens of the United States, and it has to stop. And we establish, in accord with the Constitution, our own provisional government. And we don't recognize your slavery-based, exploitative, parasitical institutions as government. Now, he was put down immediately. He had a trial that went on for a couple months in which he was very eloquent, and he wrote some very memorable things. So it was a failure. However, it totally transformed the country. After that point, people who were willing to tolerate slavery were no longer willing to tolerate it. And it became clear to many intellectuals that there was going to be that something had to be done. Now, I don't want to say that Lincoln was a totally heroic figure. I mean, he was. After John Brown, of course, Lincoln was deeply compromised, specifically because he had a lot of dealings as a lawyer with the railroads. He was backed by the Vanderbilts, and they pushed the Civil War to be things that it shouldn't have been, in my opinion. But the initial stand on slavery was, I think, an appropriate and brave one. Because slavery in the 1850s was extending its tentacles into free farmers in the South, right? That the same restrictions on property and on action and civil liberties were being extended out into ordinary people. And this is what's happening in the United States, where we have this enormous prison population, which I would call them slaves. And as a result of having 4 million prisoners, largest prison population in the world, this is extending its influence through our entire society, in which our schools are becoming more like prisons, in which our institutions, our workplace, our local neighborhoods, God forbid, our smart cities, are looking more and more like prisons.
Yeah, certainly. And just less than 10 minutes away from Live1.tv is the largest penal colony in the world, Rikers Island.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's, as you know, it's been very much a covert effort to transform the United States under the radar for most people. And that has, of course, been one of the purposes of things like COVID-19 or 9/11, is to create these distractions, which are real. I mean, they are real threats, but they keep people from focusing on these long-term transformations. And this is part of this new form of warfare, which Israel is in some ways the cutting edges, that people sort of assume that in warfare that you want to, the faster you do it, the better, right? You use supersonic jets or missiles or whatever. But in fact, people who actually understand military intelligence issues know that there's a opposite aspect as well, which is to say, the slower you do it, the more effective it will be, the less resistance you'll get. And so what we get is a sort of punctuated alternation, sort of symphonic alternation between the two, which is what has been carried out over the last 25 years. So you'll have was Oklahoma or 9/11, you'll have this sort of radical stimulation, which is disturbing and shows something's wrong. And then you'll go back to this sort of stasis, boring stasis, which then allows for the institutional transformations. And then when you get to the limit of what you can change in terms of creating a totalitarian system, then you have to have another incident to sort of shock people. And this has to do, to some degree, with the structure of the human mind, the brain, the relationship between the amygdala, which responds to fear, right, and the prefrontal cortex, which is where you can sort of convergence of information for making more rational, logical decisions. And so if you have a 9/11 incident, the amygdala overrides the prefrontal cortex, right? It's the fight or flight response. And that allows people to be manipulated emotionally without their being aware that they're being manipulated.
Please continue. What you're talking about, it's in my conversations for the last 10 years. So I'm very interested in everything you're saying.
Well, so I guess the point of this is to run as a candidate, a potential candidate for president, who's actually talking about what's going on, as opposed to, the limited hangout which is offered to you. And that was really what was so discouraging. And that's why I think there's value, even a candidate of one. That's why I hope to do this talk in San Francisco on May 9th, and then in New York City on May 2nd, maybe something in Washington, D.C., if possible. And I want to talk to people and sort of say, it doesn't really matter what happens to me, whether I, elected or have to leave the country, or whether you find me floating in the East River. This is really not important. What's important is to take a stand and say, we need a politics. Politics is not a bad word in and of itself, or it doesn't have to be. That a politics which reflects the actual reality of what's happening. And if the real politics in the United States is a politics in which multinational private equity, investment banks, working with a small number of extremely rich families, basically all over the world, Chinese, Japanese, Turkish, Russian, German, American, etc. America has a little bit more billionaires than other countries, but we don't have a monopoly on billionaires. Are using these institutions to dumb down the population, following a series of supercomputer guided trajectories, right? For dumbing down the population, for slowly building up walls. For example, you have like on your street, you'll see today there's like a little barrier by the road, and then 6 months later it'll be taller, and a year later it'll be made out of concrete. And this is the classic Israeli approach, right? The Israel,
And then there'll be a booth with one person inside.
there'll be a guy who's done, and then it keeps scaling up. And that's the whole point of Gaza, and what's been going on for the last 15 years is the companies like Black Cube and others in Israel are developing these technologies for slowly sort of leading people in, and then dividing them up against each other, and then essentially taking them down. And it's mapped out using supercomputers over 5, 10, 15-year blocks. So this is what politics is. It's not about Trump's trials or Biden. I don't even know which Biden we're talking about, but this is really sort of it is real. I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but it's not where the action is. Politics now is about class. It's about assets and ownership of assets. It's about control of information, but most importantly, it's about sovereignty and sort of independence, liberty, what we'd say in the American classic sense, to be able to think for yourself and act for yourself, and to be educated in a family in a way that encourages and supports that sort of independent ability to think and apprehend, to be a citizen.
Yeah, I believe Bob Dylan said politics is basically just a word for the things that people do.
I think that's very accurate. Very accurate.
And Ron Paul, you hear all these people saying, I'm a businessman, I'm not a politician. Dr. Ron Paul actually used to say, I'm a politician, look at my record.
Well, I think that's what it ought to be. That's really what it ought to be. I mean, Barack Obama, I don't want to say it started with Barack Obama, but he was the classic sort of transformative figure in that respect, that he became basically like Adidas, right? A brand. And he really didn't make any decisions. I think he became president basically for signing a bunch of agreements that they were not going to persecute any of these financial giants who made a fortune under the Bush administration. And he agreed to go forward with this whole quantitative easing program, essentially to facilitate the takeover of the United States by multinational private equity and investment banks. That was his job. And so the first Black African American president, which by the way is a fiction since he isn't an African American to start with, that was the sort of way of easing that transition for Americans. They could feel that we have this progressive, Martin Luther King type figure, but it was the complete opposite.
Wow. So that people who are just joining us here right now, we're talking with presidential candidate Emanuel Pastreich, and he's running in 2024. Please continue with what you're telling us.
Right. So, I mean, for those who are interested in like how I could possibly be president, I think the answer is pretty clear. I mean, my odds are 50-50, I would say, at this point. So how would that work? Well, obviously, I'm not going to be able to get on the ballot anywhere because I'm blocked from the beginning. So the approach would be to say that we're going to establish a constitutional democracy, a republic in the United States. And so when push comes to shove, we're going to have the legitimacy to put together a real government. Now, you may think this is, pie in the sky, crazy ideas of this, former professor in his little room dreaming up crazy stuff. But we're on track for a intentional crisis around the election. Intentional in the sense that various investment banks and wealthy individuals see benefit from some sort of constitutional crisis in the United States regarding the election. And so in that case, I would be quite competitive, right? Since I'm actually following the Constitution, following the law, recognize the United States as a republic. This is one of the big problems we have in America these days. People tend to talk about democracy. They don't really talk about a republic. But a republic is at least as important or more important than a democracy, because democracy is like just voting for somebody. This is so easily manipulated and exploited. Whereas republic means you have institutions for deliberative planning and implementation for policy with checks and balances that mean you actually have a functional government. It's possible to have a democracy in the sense that the masses are satisfied with a bread and circuses agenda, which is in fact a totally totalitarian system. In fact, I would say that's where we are now.
Okay, so where should we take this conversation? Now, this is this is the type of conversations I enjoy, but are the people who smoke cigarettes, buy lottery tickets, and just watch sports all day, how are you going to connect with those voters?
Right. So this is obviously a difficult task. I think the first thing we should recognize is that the American citizens who are, disengaged or who are interested in fashion or pornography or online games or gambling or the stock market and how much their tiny little investment is going up and down, that these people are victims. They're victims. If this is someone tuning in has that tendency, you're a victim. So what happened? I mean, basically, we have to get back to the bitter truth. The bitter tonic known as truth, i.e., the truth is bitter and difficult to swallow, but it's the only medicine that can cure us. And the truth is that this consumption, short-term entertainment, stimulation, sexual excitement, drinking or whatever, that this was basically cooked up. Starting in the 1950s, but it's become much more sophisticated by multinational corporations and banks as a way to undermine citizens, to destroy democratic process. And we see it. I mean, for example, if you see advertising on TV for drugs, for example, for pharmaceuticals, et cetera, that advertising is not just to try and get you to buy their pharmaceutical. In most cases, it's not at all about selling you something. It's about controlling the content. That's why they put those ads up. And the way they control the content is they make these broadcasts that emphasize in the way movies are made, that we should all live in a sort of upper middle class environment. If you don't live that way, then you're a failure. To downgrade moral action, to have like superhero type, Superman, but to be a good father, a good mother, a responsible member of society, standing up for important things, sort of like was To Kill a Mockingbird type content. This has really disappeared from the media, and this is not an accident. This is an attempt to dumb us down and make us more passive. So I think that's the starting point, is for those of us who are already in the movement, to recognize that these people are victims, that we can bring them over by having them understand the way in which these interests have compromised us. But that we should be both engaging, understanding. But I think we also have to take a stand. I mean, was my case on COVID-19. One of the reasons why I was basically thrown out of the country in February of 2020 when I started my campaign, because I started with a totally uncompromising position on COVID-19, and my platform and says, I mean, not only do all the documents related to COVID-19 operation have to be declassified, not only do we seize the assets of all the multinational investment banks and pharmaceutical companies who are behind this, not only do we go after the assets of the billionaire families like the Koch family or the
Albert Bourla at Pfizer.
There's a whole variety. I mean, I hesitate to. I mean, I had names in certain, in the Walton family, for example. Not only the Mercer, I mean, there's a whole bunch of these groups. Go after their money, right? That's when COVID-19 is over. That I think if we say something like, oh, you don't have to get vaccines anymore, maybe you don't have to wear a mask unless we tell you to, this is not the end of COVID-19. And we're absolutely guaranteed that if we don't clean house, that they're going to do it some other way. And they're already doing it. I mean, right now, the other way is threatening world war, which is also extremely profitable for some people. Although I think they don't necessarily all want war, but getting to the edge of war is obviously in their financial and political interests.
Yeah, and speaking about dumbing people down, would you agree that, for example, I'd like to give the example of Rupert Murdoch's company, News Corp, which produces the New York Post. So sometimes there's stories in the Post which seem to be legitimate and very valuable. And however, but if you look at it overall and you look at the day-to-day content, it seems to me like I have been studying it, and actually I have as a project folder a whole research on the New York Post, and it keeps on turning my stomach. We haven't actually got it together, but I've been studying. It seems at one point they were pushing 6 to 10 stories per issue on the royal family. And really really banal things too, like Prince Harry thinks that his older brother spends too much time watching TV and shouldn't be king, or these ridiculous things. But there wouldn't be one or two; there would be 6 to 10 per issue, and it's still continuing today. So Edward Snowden made a release in his disclosures in 2013. When he took a scraper into the NSA building when he was working in Hawaii. I think that was NSA, or he might have been at Booz Allen, but he took a scraper and he scraped out a bunch of files. One of them included a photograph of King Charles inside of GCHQ with Camilla. So we're talking the King of England inside the Mass Surveillance Center, GCHQ, which shares its data according to information with the United States, the private records of Americans. So so I think probably the royal family or somebody in England is paying for this PR, which is coming to Americans. rather than us having a defiant attitude about a king in our midst who has access to our private records. But it isn't only that, the royal family, how they're, but there will be articles where it looks like they're being critical of, it's just soap opera, dumbing down, and then they get real hardcore on the real issues, like we got to get more money into the Ukraine, and then Piers Morgan will write a story and say, come on, get a stiff upper grip, Americans, and get more funding. And this paper, and it's not only the New York Post, it's pretty much all of the mainstream. But I take a look at it from the Times. It's torture to read it, and I just wish more people could be liberated from the crap. It's really an unhealthy, toxic experience, and people like to know what's going on around the world. News can be, really educational. It can, people like to know the news, and it's so sad when it gets so distorted.
Right. Well, it's 100% accurate, and I could just make a couple comments. Obviously, there are different market shares, but the basic bottom line is not that different from the New York Times. The New York Times throws in a little bit more hard vocabulary to make sure you went to college, has some pictures of upper middle class people at art shows and in their Upper West Side apartments, their studio lofts. But the basic line is similar, and it's an alternation between sort of the banal and the stimulating and the horrifying, sort of like a carnival type horror movies. And this is intentional. On the case of the British royal family, I think we really need to look at the relationship between the Iron Triangle, really, which is between Washington, D.C., to some degree New York, London, and Tel Aviv, and now Jerusalem. And so these three are linked together basically as the sort of this cancerous remnants of the British Empire, which have taken on a new form, very invigorated. There's and that's where, as Americans, coming back to why the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence are so unpopular, is that these are texts written on the assumption that the United States would be independent from the British Empire, right? That was the bottom line, and that there's a real interest in making us forget what the independence of the United States is, or, and this is, I think, equally pernicious, making it so that only people who are branded as conservatives talk about the Constitution and the governance, the republic, and the progressives are lost in identity politics or gender politics or distractions, not about how government is actually run.
Thank you for joining us in our conversation with Emanuel Pastreich, 2024 presidential candidate. Be sure to follow Live1.tv on social media, and take care.